Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 762, and today is February 24th, 2025. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. We have a good amount of news to get through on today's show, so I want to jump into it pretty quickly. But first, I have to mention that at the Libertarian Institute, we are hosting our fundraiser. And so head on over, make a donation, make sure that I could keep producing content in this libertarian sphere, whether it's this show, the Kyle Anzalone show, all the articles that I write. I think I'm up to about 75 or so for the Institute alone this year. All the news blasts that I put out for the Institute, which, are a little bit more opinion pieces covering current events. So definitely, if you haven't already, head on over and help us out over at the Institute. We really appreciate your support, and we do put it to good use. The money goes to paying staff to produce all this content, so we can have time in our days to go ahead and write and cover what's going on in the world. So for, again, those of you who are considering it, you can get some great kitbats at the Institute, including a signed copy of Scott Horton's new book, Provoke. All right. With that, the show is hosted at the Libertarian Institute, reposted on the blog at antiwar.com, YouTube, Rumble, or Odysee for the video version of the show. It's up anywhere you can listen to audio podcasts, and follow me on Twitter at KyleAnzalone_ for all my work. Everything I do pretty much always ends up on my Twitter account. And last, subscribe to the Kyle Anzalone Show if you haven't already. We will have another episode out this afternoon. All right, everyone, starting off here, U.S. and Russia agreed to hold more talks this week on improving ties. So Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov said Sunday that the U.S. and Russian officials will hold another round of talks on improving relations sometime in the past week. Ryabkov said, according to RT, we are open to contacts with the American side, in particular to address the irritants in bilateral relations. We expect progress when the meeting is scheduled for the end of the coming week takes place. During high-level talks in Saudi Arabia on February 18th, the U.S. and Russian delegations agreed to take steps to normalize diplomatic relations and to work to end the war in Ukraine. Ryabkov said there are quite a lot of contacts now between the two countries. President Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin are expected to meet in person sometime soon, but it's unclear when or where that might happen. Both leaders have invited each other to their respective countries when they spoke on the phone earlier this month, but it will be the first summit likely to happen will be in a third country. It remains unclear what sort of deal could be reached to end the war in Ukraine. The Trump administration has acknowledged that two President Zelensky's main demands, Ukrainian NATO membership and a return to the pre-2014 borders, are unrealistic, but so far, Ukrainian leader doesn't seem willing to make significant concessions. In the meantime, fighting in Ukraine continues to rage along the front lines, and Russia continues to launch heavy bombardments. On Sunday, the Ukrainian military said Russia fired a record 267 drones into Ukraine overnight. Okay, so this next story is truly crazy. Zelensky pushes back on mineral deal, says Ukraine is not in debt to the United States. So on Sunday, Ukrainian President Zelensky pushed back on the terms of a rare earth minerals deal that the Trump administration wants him to sign, insisting Ukraine was not in debt to the United States. President Trump has previously said that he wants to deal with Ukraine that would give the U.S. access to about $500 billion in Ukrainian rare earth minerals and other natural resources. So Zelensky said, let's first clarify the 500 billion figure. I know that we had 100 billion in US aid provided to Ukraine, and that's a fact, but I'm not going to acknowledge 500 billion regardless of what anyone says, with all due respect to our partners. So the Ukrainian leader also said he was not prepared to pay back the 100 billion because President Biden and Congress agreed to provide the aid as grant, not as loans to be paid back. So Zelensky said, I made agreements with Biden and the U.S. Congress. I'm grateful to Congress. It was about grant support, and a grant is not debt. We don't have to repay a debt. So it's not about the figure. It's about the fact that we do not recognize it as a debt. The Ukrainian leader said he was willing to reach a new deal that would involve the U.S. getting resources in exchange for continued U.S. support. He said, if the condition today is that the United States, our strategic partner, says, we will give you assistance, but you have to repay it with profit for the United States, that's an agreement, not a grant. That's a new agreement. I'm ready for such a dialogue, and I'm sure it will be positive. According to media reports, the deal the U.S. has offered Zelensky would have given the U.S. 50% of the rights to Ukrainian rare earth minerals. Zelensky said on Sunday that he would not sign something that 10 generations of Ukrainians will have to repay. Zelensky's latest comments about the potential deal are sure to anger President Trump. U.S. National Security Advisor Mike Waltz said Trump was very frustrated over Zelensky's refusal to sign the deal his administration had offered. The lack of an agreement was one of the reasons Trump lashed out at Zelensky, calling him a dictator over the lack of elections in Ukraine. In an apparent response to Trump's comments, Zelensky said Sunday that he was willing to resign if it brought peace and NATO membership to Ukraine. He said, and this is a quote, if it guarantees peace for Ukraine, if you really need me to resign, I am ready. I can exchange it for NATO, he said. So Trump's administration has already ruled out Ukrainian NATO membership as a part of a future peace deal with Russia, since the idea is a non-starter for negotiations with Moscow. So that Zelensky is now, and look, most of the money I believe the U.S. has given Ukraine was not in any way something that was talked about being repaid, but throughout the Biden administration and when there was debates in the U.S. about should we really be giving Ukraine all this money, Zelensky was saying, give it to us in a loan and we'll repay it back to you. And that he's now trying to say, oh no, we don't owe you that money is just really crazy for him to be saying at this point. I think the problem with this in particular for Zelensky is that he needs to be doing what he can to not make Donald Trump upset. And I mean, it may seem childish that that's the course you have to take, but, the U.S. is giving Ukraine a lot of money and a lot of support, and Ukraine's ability to keep fighting in this war relies on U.S. money and support. And so to not directly upset the leadership of your main benefactor is, I think, a reasonable thing to expect. Now, I'm not sure what most of Ukraine's rare earth minerals are either in territory that's controlled by Russia or near territory that is controlled by Russia. So I'm kind of confused as to how Trump thinks he's going to get 500 billion of rare earth minerals out of Ukraine. And my concern is that if the U.S. does go along with this agreement, first of all, it's going to be predatory for the Ukrainian people. The U.S. government has given the Ukrainian government a lot of money over the past 3 years. And I certainly understand the desire of some Americans to try to recoup that money. However, the war was waged by the Biden administration using the Ukrainian people. And so now if we have to cut our losses and allow, Ukraine to access and sell off their own natural resources to rebuild their country post-war is probably a better path forward here. So, I'm not in favor of the rare earth deal. I think there's a potential that the rare earth deal could be a pitfall to continuing the war, just because there's going to be a consensus that the U.S. then has to, secure close to the front lines, and who knows exactly how that all works out and plays out. But I think there's a real possibility that the Trump administration is still open to continuing the proxy war, just under the right and lucrative enough terms for Washington. And so the mineral deal could take us into that direction. Now, so that's all very baffling. Then Zelensky's offer, I'll resign in exchange for NATO membership, is just silly. I'm not sure where he got the idea that that's what Trump was suggesting. He was calling for Ukraine to hold elections, not necessarily for Zelensky to resign. And again, Trump's issue with Zelensky isn't that he's a bad leader for Ukraine. I think it's more that Zelensky won't agree to this mineral deal that Trump wants and hasn't been just, fluffing Trump in public, trying to do everything he can to kind of puff up the reputation of the American president, to be like, oh, thank goodness for our amazing American benefactors. If it wasn't for Donald Trump's, tough nose policy, the Russians would have never agreed to sit down at the table with anyone. What a genius. What a beautiful man. If we only had 2 more months worth of weapons to get on a better footing with the Russians, I think he could really strike a good, that's the way I think he has to discuss it, has to talk about if Zelensky wants weapons. What Zelensky is doing is now attacking Donald Trump, which, Trump would make a deal with Russia out of spite at this point. I think is something that we could see happening here when, the Russians are engaging with him and, speaking highly of Trump and saying, oh, this presents a unique opportunity. The Biden administration won't be able to do this. That's what Trump wants to hear. That's what's going to convince Trump one way or the other. I think his mind could be changed. And so, there's that real risk here that we're talking about. But there is no possibility that Zelensky resigning is going to end up in exchange for NATO membership. Now, for Zelensky, I mean, that's just an interesting offer, as a good way to get the hell out of Dodge, as there's more and more questions being raised about the amount of corruption that's going on in Kiev and just where all the Western money that was dumped into Ukraine over the past 3 years went. All right, moving over to the Middle East. Hamas says Israel's delay in releasing Palestinians is a blatant violation of the ceasefire deal. So on Sunday, Hamas responded to Israel's decision to delay the release of more than 600 Palestinians from Israeli jails as a blatant violation of the hostage and ceasefire deal. Under the deal, Israel is supposed to release 620 Palestinians, including women and children detained in Gaza after October 7th, in exchange for the 6 Israeli hostages Hamas handed over on Saturday. But Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said the release was delayed over alleged Hamas violations, including the handover ceremonies, which he said humiliated the Israeli hostages. And certainly, I think when you're talking about the hostages who are captured members of the IDF, it's propaganda from Hamas's standpoint. At the same time, they're not being, spit on. They're not having rocks thrown at them. They're not, in any way being tortured or abused on the stage. They're a part of a propaganda ceremony for Hamas, right? And it's probably out of line with the spirit of the agreement. That's something you could maybe say. It's probably, it is in bad taste, particularly the exchange of the young children that happened and that they made a ceremony out of that as well. Of course, this is Hamas. This isn't some group that you expect to be moral and virtuous and to do everything right. And so my point is just that this, okay, fair to complain about this. At the same time, when these hostages are released, Israel is taking pictures. They're celebrating the release of the hostages. But when the Palestinian prisoners are being released, they're being beaten. They're being sent to the hospital. Their family homes are being raided. And certainly in the same way, completely out of line with the spirit and at times the actual text of the ceasefire and hostage agreement. And so both sides are making propaganda points when it comes to these hostage releases. And, if they sit down and decide going forward, we're not going to do this, the Palestinians, when they're released to the West Bank or Gaza, could celebrate, but Hamas isn't going to celebrate the handover. I think that would be a better situation. I think it would create better optics for the populations of both countries to create more political will to continue the agreement. That being said, this isn't something that is in any way justifies Netanyahu not releasing the Palestinian captives after the Israeli hostages were released. So in response, Hamas official Ezrat El-Rashk said Netanyahu's decision reflects a deliberate attempt to disrupt the agreement. It represents a blatant violation of its terms, and it shows the occupation's lack of reliability in implementing its obligations. And there, I certainly think we see, a true statement in that while the ceremonies by Hamas are maybe a violation of the spirit of the agreement, Netanyahu not allowing the release of these hostages is a blatant just violation of the agreement and wrong. So Israel has repeatedly violated the ceasefire deal, including by continuing to shoot and bomb Palestinians in Gaza. Since the ceasefire went into effect on January 19th, Israeli forces have killed more than 100 Palestinians in the territory. Netanyahu said the release of 620 Palestinians was delayed until the release of the next hostages has been assured and without the humiliating ceremonies. So the 6 Israelis freed by Hamas on Saturday were the last of the surviving hostages that were set to be released under the first phase of the ceasefire deal. And the progress of the negotiations on the second phase, which is Israel is repeatedly delaying, is unclear. So a Hamas official said Sunday that the negotiations would be suspended until Israel released the Palestinians. So Israeli media report that Netanyahu has added several new demands for the second phase, including continued Israeli security control over Gaza and the disarmament and removal of Hamas, two conditions that Hamas has strongly rejected. So Netanyahu has also been warning he's ready to restart Israel's genocidal war on Gaza, a threat that he repeated on Sunday. Netanyahu said, "We are prepared to resume intense fighting at any moment. In Gaza, we have eliminated most of Hamas organization forces, but there is no doubt we will complete the war's objectives entirely through negotiations or by other means." And so just a couple more points on this. I think what Israel and the U.S. are going to try to do is they're going to say that so phase 1, I think, is supposed to end in the next week or so. The next weekend, we're supposed to have the final round of hostage exchange for phase 1. Hamas has effectively already completed theirs. They have the body, I believe, of 4 more Israeli hostages that they will release. But then after that, we're supposed to enter into phase 2, where there's another 59, I believe, Israeli hostages. About half of those are expected to be alive. And then we're supposed to get the gradual release of those hostages as well. However, phase 1 was really just a ceasefire deal. Aid was supposed to come into Gaza, and the hostages were supposed to be released. And so while Hamas was essentially getting and Palestinians were getting maybe some temporary reprieve during the first round of negotiations, Israel, I think, the first phase of the deal. I think Israel was really getting the better end of the deal on phase 1, because it's far easier for Israel to rearrest the Palestinians that have been released or arrest additional Palestinians, as they have been in the West Bank over the past few weeks anyways, versus Hamas to take more Israeli captives, right? And so when Hamas is giving up their captives, they're giving up their future leverage. Now, in phase 2, you're supposed to start to see the rebuilding of Gaza. You're supposed to start to see the complete Israeli withdrawal from Gaza, and then the final release of the hostages. And so with the rebuilding of Gaza, then you get some real permanent benefits for the Palestinian people, but that doesn't happen until phase 2. And so I think what they're going to try to do is just extend phase 1 and have more hostage releases. And, Israel is going to continue to delay allowing the aid into Gaza. They're going to only release half of the Palestinian prisoners. They're going to rearrest some of them, right? They're going to play these games. And I think ultimately the goal is to have Hamas break the deal. But if nothing else, they'll get all the Israeli hostages back, and then they'll go back to war in Gaza. All right. Next up here, Israeli defense minister says 40,000 forcibly displaced Palestinians in the West Bank cannot return home. So the Israeli defense minister, Israel Katz, said Sunday that the Israeli military has forcibly displaced about 40,000 Palestinians in the northern occupied West Bank, and that they couldn't return home as the IDF will be operating in the area over the next year, raising fears of a new ethnic cleansing campaign. The Israeli military launched the current operation in the West Bank, dubbed Iron Wall, on January 21st, just 2 days after the ceasefire in Gaza started. I think that's very important to recognize. It has been focused on the northern cities of Jenin and Tulkrum, but has spread elsewhere in the occupied territory. In new escalation, Israeli tanks entered the West Bank on Sunday for the first time since 2002. Katz said in a statement that he ordered the Israeli military to prepare for an extended stay in the camps that have been cleared for the coming year and not to allow any residents to return. We will not allow the return to reality that existed in the past. We will continue to clear refugee camps and other terrorist centers in order to dismantle the militant battalions and terrorist infrastructure of extremist Islam that were built. The tank deployment into the West Bank came after the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, ordered an escalation in the occupied territories following the bombing of empty buses in the Israeli city of Bet Yam near Tel Aviv. Israeli officials blamed West Bank resistance groups for the attack, and a note left said revenge from Tulkrum. However, 2 Jewish Israelis were arrested over their involvement in the alleged bombing. According to the United Nations, more than 50 Palestinians have been killed from Israeli forces in the West Bank since the start of the new operations last month. The dead include many civilians and children, as the Israeli military has expanded an open fire order in the occupied territory. On Friday, 2 Palestinian children were killed by Israeli troops in the West Bank. A 13-year-old girl was shot in the back while standing in a courtyard of her family home in Jenin, and then a 12-year-old boy was also shot in the back while standing near the home of a family member in the West Bank city of Hebron. Both were shot by Israeli troops who were inside armored vehicles. And again, we keep talking about that, but I think it's such an important point to hammer home. Why would armed Israeli troopers in an armored vehicle shoot Palestinian children in the back as they're standing on their family's property in their homes? Why do that? It's because they want every single Palestinian to consider that at any single time, your child could just be standing outside, just playing, just being a kid, and they could be murdered by an Israeli soldier for no reason, with no justification, with no potential for justice, accountability, or any punishment whatsoever for that Israeli soldier. And of course, the overall goal is to get the Palestinians to leave the West Bank, this is how they are trying to conduct this genocide. So Israel's escalation in the West Bank has often also involved the destruction of infrastructure, including roads and homes, mirroring strategies of the IDF in Gaza. And when it was first launched, Katz said that the Israeli military was applying lessons it had learned in Gaza to the West Bank. All right, next up here, this one from Jason Ditz. Israel carries out multiple strikes against southern Lebanon over flights at Nasrallah's funeral. So much of the news in Lebanon on Sunday was expected to be centered around the funeral of former Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah, who was killed in late September by an Israeli airstrike. The Lebanon news never strays too far from Israeli action, however. Israeli warplanes were seen overhead at Beirut Stadium where the funeral was held. The Israeli Defense Minister, Israel Katz, said the warplanes send a clear message that anyone threatening Israel will meet their end. But a lot more than a big funeral, and Israeli warplanes menacing big funeral was happening. At least 7 Israeli airstrikes reported on Sunday, mostly in the south, but also in the east along the Lebanon-Syria border. So casualty figures are still coming in, though a Syrian girl was reported among the injured in the airstrike in, I believe this is southern Lebanon, and 5 other strikes were centered around the South Governance, which a 7th strike reported near Hermel in the Beka Hermel Governorate along the Syrian border. So the South Governorate was clearly the main focus of the strikes, with 4 of the 5 strikes targeting the Tyre district. The 5th strike was in the South Sidon district. It is not clear what exactly was hit in all of these strikes, though Israel claims they were attacking Hezbollah targets and suggested that some of the sites they strike may have even had rockets launchers within. Israeli further claimed the existence of the targets they decided to attack was a violation of the understanding of the ceasefire with Lebanon, though clearly directly striking several targets in Lebanon and having warplanes overfly a major event on the outskirts of Lebanon's capital city are much more visible and verifiable violations than anything Hezbollah has purported to have done. And so Israel just continues to completely ignore and trample all over the ceasefire with Lebanon. Next up here, latest U.S. strike killed brother of Syrian government minister. So the U.S. has continued carrying out airstrikes against Syria's Idlib governance near Tel Al-Karma, a refugee camp this weekend, targeting and killing Wassam Tashin Baradar, who they described as a senior leadership facilitator for the Al-Qaeda-linked Haras al-Din. It is the 3rd U.S. strike against Idlib since President Trump took office last month, and all 3 reportedly targeted and killed Haras al-Din leaders. This particularly noteworthy since Haras al-Din announced it was dissolving in late January before any of these strikes. The latest attack perhaps was an even bigger deal because the target was the brother of Samar Baradar, who is the Syrian government's current regional endowments minister. The ministry ensures that endowments are used properly for maintaining the mosque and to help pray for religious education. So the U.S. claimed that the target they killed was an active member of Haras al-Din, despite the obvious handicap that the group has been having apparently dissolved weeks ago. Syrian researchers are also reporting that the man actually left the group 5 years ago after becoming disillusioned with the group. The statement from researcher Mohammed Murad al-Far, who claimed to have met Baradar in 2022 after he allegedly left Haras al-Din and became a businessman, declaring that the United States had killed an isolated civilian citizen and urging that they retract their previous targets and reevaluate them. That's unlikely to happen, as the U.S. at least seems satisfied with the narrative that the target was an active finance and logistics officer at Haras al-Din, and indeed has never appeared to even acknowledge that the very public dissolution of the organization. Now, these groups do kind of dissolve and reemerge all the time, so I'm not sure how Al-Qaeda this guy actually was. Seems to be a pretty big question mark for the Syrian government too. If the brothers of their ministers are being killed in American airstrikes, how much ties to Al-Qaeda do they have? All right, one more article here. So for those of you watching, I got the wrong article up here, but I'll just go ahead and mention Trump's envoy says Hamas must physically leave Gaza. I wrote this one for the Institute on February 23rd. I will be discussing that on the Kyle Anzalone show later today, so subscribe to that channel. It's the first link in the show notes page. That way you don't miss that episode. All right, the actual last article I have for the show today, Netanyahu says Israel won't allow Syrian forces south of Damascus. Netanyahu declared Sunday that Israel wouldn't allow any Syrian forces to be in areas south of Damascus and said the Israeli occupation of southern Syria would continue for an unlimited period of time. So Netanyahu said, "Take note, we will not allow HTS forces or the new Syrian army to enter area south of Damascus." HTS, Tahrir al-Sham, is the Al-Qaeda offshoot that took power in Damascus following the regime change that ousted former President Bashar al-Assad. Netanyahu added, "We demand the complete demilitarization of southern Syria and the provinces of Quintera, Dara, and Sadawaya from the forces of the new regime. Likewise, we will not tolerate any threat to the Druze community in southern Syria." And so it looks like they're in trying to couch some of the occupation of southern Syria and protecting minorities, and being afraid of Al Qaeda, when in reality this was a regime change that happened in large part thanks to Israel and Netanyahu. And so kind of ridiculous to use that to then justify the occupation of southern Syria, but that's what Israel's doing. All right, everyone, thank you all so much for tuning into the show today, and being so understanding with me over the past week, as I was and the rest of my family were battling just not feeling well, and was hard to sleep, and then feeling sick. I couldn't get out as many shows as I wanted to last week, so I do apologize for that, but we are back on track this week. I am feeling great and ready to do my best to debunk the lies of the military-industrial complex. Thanks, everyone.